Elizabeth Woodville died on June 8, 1492. The funeral of Edward IV's widow was so modest that it even shocked the Herald tasked with recording the event. At least this is how some historians have interpreted the sources, reading between the lines to suggest a deliberate slight. It is not difficult to assume that King Henry VII, known for his frugality, used the occasion to reveal his true feelings about his mother-in-law. After all, even Elizabeth of York did not attend. But is this interpretation accurate? Welcome back to Lemmy History. Today, I want to explore a topic that frequently comes up in the comments on my videos, the supposedly miserable funeral of Elizabeth Woodville. Given the time period under discussion, this video is closely connected to my series on Elizabeth of York and Margaret of Burgundy. However, it is not part of that series, as I will focus solely on the funeral and its historical context. I discuss why Elizabeth Woodville no longer lived at court after 1487 and instead resided at Bermondsey Abbey in episode 2 of the series, which will be released on March 14, 2025. For the purposes of this video, the key point to note is that Elizabeth Woodville was not isolated from her family. Bermondsey Abbey was just 3.4 miles, 5.7 kilometers from Westminster, an easy journey across the Thames even in the 15th century taking less than an hour. Numerous records confirm visits from her daughters and her own trips to court, demonstrating that she remained connected to her family. The central question for today's discussion is this: how was the palace informed of her death and what happened next? A crucial factor in planning any funeral at the time was the deceased's own will, which often provided clear instructions on the matter. Elizabeth Woodville wrote her will late in life on April 10, 1492, almost exactly 9 years after the death of her husband Edward IV. According to the Herald, she was already on her deathbed at the time. It was likely no coincidence that she chose this particular moment to put her final wishes into writing. Her will is relatively brief, which she explains by stating that she has only a few worldly possessions to bequeath. For a deeper discussion on this, we refer to episode 2. Regarding her funeral, her instructions are as follows: Item, I bequeath my body to be buried with the body of my lord at Windsor, according to the will of my said lord and mine, without pompies entreng or costly expenses done thereabout. She clearly wished to be buried alongside her husband Edward IV, and specified that the burial should take place without pompies entreng and unnecessary expenses. However, the Herald interprets the matter of pomp differently than I would. He writes, And the said Quen desired in her death abede that as soon as she should be deceased, she should in all goodly haste without any worldly pompe by water conveyed to Windsor, and there to be buried in the same voe that her houseband the king was buried in. I interpret Elizabeth's instructions to mean that there should be no grand display upon her arrival in Windsor. However, the Herald extends her request to the entire funeral, seemingly justifying the lack of expense. Examining his account in detail can help us understand why this difference in interpretation is significant. Elizabeth was accompanied by 5 people on her final journey from Bermondsey Abbey to Windsor: Prior John Ingleby, Dr. Bent, one of the executors of her will, Edmund Holt, a cousin, Mistress Grace, an illegitimate daughter of Edward IV, and a lady-in-waiting whose name the Herald does not reveal. Historian Ewan C. Roger suggests that this group was assembled hastily, consisting of individuals who were readily available in London. On the evening of June 10th, the former Queen arrived at Windsor. The Herald describes the scene as follows: And as it told to me, un prest of the college and a clerk received her in the castell, and so privily about 11 of the clock in the night, she was buried with cute any solemne derege, or the mome any solemne mass dune for her obehit. The first part of this account is particularly significant, as it reveals that the Herald was not present himself. Elizabeth was received at the castle, which suggests she most likely arrived via Curfew Tower. In this respect, her request for a lack of pomp was honoured. It is also worth noting the role of Prior Ingleby, whom Elizabeth had known for nearly 15 years. He held considerable influence over her in religious matters and was known for his frugality, which may have shaped aspects of the funeral arrangements. The Herald states that Elizabeth was buried immediately, without a dirige or mass. Her wooden coffin was lowered directly into Edward IV's burial chamber, an unusual practice at the time. Typically, funerals were delayed for several days. Elizabeth of York, for instance, was laid to rest 10 days after her passing. The Herald also found the bier used in the funeral remarkable. That day there was nothing done solemnly for her saving a low hearse, such as they use for the common people, with 4 wooden candlestickes about a hit, and a cloth of blacker cloth of gold over hit, with 4 candlestickes of silver and gilt, ever she having a taper of no great weight, and 2 scutcheons of her arms crowned pinned on that cloth. Despite the simplicity of her immediate burial, the rest of the funeral proceedings followed standard customs. In the days after Elizabeth's arrival at Windsor, Edmund Audley, Bishop of Rochester, and formerly associated with St. George's Chapel, presided over the ceremonies. All of her surviving blood relatives attended, except for the Queen and her children. There was a clear reason for this. Elizabeth of York was heavily pregnant and already confined to her chambers. She gave birth 3 weeks later. It remains uncertain whether she was informed of her mother's death before the birth. It is possible the news was withheld to avoid distressing her. King Henry VII, as was customary, did not attend the funeral. At the time, he was fully occupied with preparations for the impending war against France. However, several of his confidants were present, including Sir Charles Somerset, who had family ties to the Woodvilles through the Herbert line, and Edmund Chatterton, who had served Elizabeth of York for 2 years. The customary funeral rites were observed. Thomas, Marquess of Dorset, as Elizabeth's eldest son, fulfilled his duty by making charitable donations, including 40 shillings to a person whose identity remains unknown due to a missing portion of the report. The funeral ceremonies lasted from June 10th to June 14th, and concluded with a prayer for Elizabeth Woodville's soul, which the Herald incorporated into his account. He then ended his report on an unexpected note, turning his attention back to the Queen. "I suppose she went in, blew in likewise, as Queen Margaret, the wife of King Henry VI, went in when her mother, the Queen of Sicile, died." In medieval mourning customs, blue was a recognized color of grief. The Herald's comment suggests he was unsure whether Elizabeth of York had been informed of her mother's death. By referencing Queen Margaret's mourning attire, he subtly expressed his uncertainty in a refined and indirect manner. One question we have yet to address is what Elizabeth Woodville died of. In a 2019 essay, historian Ewan C. Roger proposed the theory that she succumbed to the plague. His central piece of evidence is a sentence written in 1511 by the Venetian ambassador, which Roger discovered in the National Archives. It reads, "The Queen Widow, mother of the late King Edward, had died of plague, and the king was troubled." The king in this case was Elizabeth Woodville's grandson, Henry VIII, whose paranoia about infectious diseases was well known. If the plague was indeed the cause of her death, it would explain several unusual aspects of her funeral. At the time, it was widely understood that plague was highly contagious. Burying her immediately would have been a necessary precaution to protect funeral attendees, chapel clergy, and Windsor staff from exposure. This theory also accounts for why only 5 people accompanied her body to Windsor, and why there was no public acknowledgement of the former Queen's arrival. Her will provided a convenient pretext to keep the event discreet. Additionally, if she had been suffering from the plague, it would explain why she wrote her will weeks before her death. She may have already known that she was gravely ill. It could also clarify why no immediate members of the royal family attended her funeral. The risk would have been far too great. However, there is a significant uncertainty. Was the plague actually spreading at that time? Given its extreme contagiousness, one would expect a broader outbreak. The last recorded epidemic in England occurred in 1479 to 1480, with a mortality rate of around 20% among those infected. That said, shortly after Elizabeth's death, Henry VII's government implemented new regulations aimed at controlling the plague, suggesting that fears of an outbreak may have resurfaced. Now let's address the elephant in the room. How strong is the evidence? First, we must consider whether the 1511 statement actually refers to Elizabeth Woodville. This is not certain. Theoretically, the ambassador could have been referring to Cecily Neville. Second, we must ask why Henry VIII would suddenly be discussing his grandmother's death nearly 2 decades later. A plausible explanation exists. In 1510, Henry and Catherine of Aragon lost a daughter who was born 2 months prematurely. Then on February 22, 1511, their infant son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, died before reaching 2 months of age. Combined with the early death of his brother Arthur, Henry may have begun to question whether hereditary diseases ran in his family. In this context, he could have been informed that his grandmother had died of plague. However, We are left with just a single sentence written nearly 20 years after Elizabeth Woodville's death. That alone is too flimsy to declare with certainty that she died of plague. Yet, it is still a compelling enough piece of evidence that the possibility cannot be ignored. Overall, the plague seems to be a far more plausible explanation than the idea of a vengeful king deliberately mocking Elizabeth Woodville. In early July, Elizabeth of York gave birth to a daughter. Henry decided to name her Elizabeth, a clear tribute not only to his wife but also to the recently deceased Elizabeth Woodville. Henry also honored Elizabeth Woodville's wishes regarding her funeral. She was taken to Windsor to be laid to rest beside her husband, Edward IV. Almost her entire family was permitted to gather to say their goodbyes. The Herald who documented the funeral was allowed to write openly about its details. As I have shown, many of the elements were reported directly to him, suggesting transparency rather than an attempt to manipulate the narrative. If Henry had truly wanted to degrade Elizabeth Woodville's funeral for propaganda purposes, it would have been just as easy to feed the Herald false information while orchestrating a deliberate humiliation behind the scenes. Additionally, Perkin Warbeck had emerged as a threat around this time. A deliberately disgraceful funeral for the former queen would have only fueled his claims that Henry VII was a tyrannical usurper. The fact that the Herald noted the funeral's simplicity suggests that such austerity was unexpected for someone of Elizabeth Woodville's status. If Henry had chosen to disregard tradition purely out of malice, he would have done so at his own political risk. Ultimately, I cannot say with certainty whether Elizabeth Woodville died of the plague or whether concerns about contagion influenced the modest nature of her funeral. It is also possible that her own will played the decisive role. Perhaps it was a combination of both. But all of these possibilities are far more likely than the idea that Henry acted out of sheer spite. After all, Elizabeth Woodville was the grandmother of his heir. But what do you think? Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.